So you should be able to see my presentation. I'll be talking about governance structures in projects and programs. And I organized the presentation in 4 parts. I'll talk a little bit about why we did it and even more shortly how we did it, because this is not a scientific conference. And then I'll present some of our results concerning sponsors, concerning steering committees, which is the term more broadly used in Europe for boards, obviously. And then steering committee work. You'll see what the difference between the last 2 items is in a minute. And as I said, most of you don't know me, at least not from this forum. I'm a management consultant, so the organization is the same as my name. I focus on strategy execution. I'm based just outside of Vienna, Austria. I also have been working as an assessor for PMA, for the Austrian IPMA Member Association, for the past 10+ years. I'm a colleague of Peter and Ormat and many others on the ISO TC258. But the role I'm here in today is a member of the special interest group PMCO's boardroom, which is aiming at improving the relationship and the cooperation between project management and senior management in the German-speaking countries. This special interest group was founded, I think, in 2014, so some 7 years ago. We're about 10 active members from Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and we're doing this in our spare time on a pro bono basis, just like GAPS is. Okay, let's get started. So why did we do this study? There's general agreement that sponsors and boards have a huge impact on project success and also on the success of the whole organizations performing these projects. And yet, if you ask yourself, who are these people and how do they perform these governance jobs in practice, you'll find that there is virtually no empirical data on that. That seems to be a question of no interest to the scientific community, apparently. And yet it is utterly important, if you want to address these people, to know who they are, to know your target audience. And therefore, we decided to do a little exploratory study. Given our limited resources, we did an online-only survey at the end of 2019, so just before the pandemic started. And this is also the reason why it took us so long to evaluate and analyze our study results, because we didn't have an opportunity to come together since and had to do everything online. The study or the survey, the questionnaire was on a per project or program basis, so not per organization, but per individual program. In fact, we didn't even collect any data on the organization behind it. We were just interested in each individual project. I'll spare you all the methodological details. If you're interested in that, you can read them in our study report. Just a brief overview of who responded. We had some 230 odd responses. A lot of them were so fragmentary that they were actually not of any use for our questions. There were 144 data sets which we could actually use for analysis, so that will be the basis for everything I'll show you from now on. And of these 144 data sets, about 3/4 were related to projects and 1/4 was related to programs, or 2 declared themselves as portfolios, but since they had an end date and they had a sponsor and they had targets, we considered them actually to be the same as programs. 2/3 of the projects and programs were internal to the sponsoring organization, 1/3 was delivered to an external client. And in terms of the type of deliverables, there was a strong tendency, or a strong predominance of IT and organizational development projects, followed by product development, innovation projects, construction projects, and a few others. So one key question we were interested in is who actually acts as sponsor. We had the expectation that, or the knowledge from our experience, that sponsors are very often high-level managers of the organization, but we wanted to know that in detail. And this turned out to be true to an even larger extent than we'd expected. So almost 60% of all sponsors are either C-level executives or heads of business units. So managers with overall economic and business accountability, if you like. And then with a large gap, there were IT heads and all other functional managers, be they finance or HR, R&D, operations, or whatever, are very, very scarcely represented in the sponsor role. We also asked about sponsor meetings, and the good news is that even these C-level executives do meet with the project manager on a regular basis, so typically once a month. I just see if I can get a highlighting device, because I'm not sure if you're seeing my mouse pointer, but here's the spotlight. No, here it is. So typically once a month for C-level executives and business unit heads, or every 2 to 3 weeks meetings if the sponsor is a functional manager or a product manager. And only about 5% of C-level executives never meet with the project manager. All others do. Some functional managers on an exception-only basis, but that is also a small minority. So coming to project boards, which is the topic of this forum. The first question was, how common are they actually? And in projects, we find that about 60% of projects have a steering committee or board. No, sorry, two-thirds two-thirds of the projects actually have a board. Most of them also have one distinct sponsors. Some, these 20% or something, have a steering committee only without one person also acting as a sponsor. About 1/3 has a sponsor only and no steering committee. A very small fraction of, not even, well, about 5%, seems to have no governance structure at all. So they neither have a sponsor nor a board. We couldn't figure out how they work, to be honest. And in programs, boards are even more common. About 90% of all programs had a board. 2/3 also had a sponsor. 1/3 had a board only. These with a board only were probably programs where spanning multiple organizations, and these organizations sort of split the role of sponsorship among themselves. And so there was no one single person acting as a sponsor. And again, some, what is it, almost 15% of programs neither had a board nor a sponsor, and I'm still wondering how they could work. So how are boards staffed? The average board has 6.3 members. So they typically have between 5 and 8 members, you could say. So that's over 60% have 5 to 8 members. There seems to be no upper boundary. We had a technical limit of 20 board members, and in some cases even that was not sufficient to map reality. But typically around 7 members, and these consist of 1 C-level executive on average on each project or program board, 1.4 heads of business units, 1.2 PPP stands for product process or portfolio managers. There's almost 1 head of IT statistically on every board, 1.3 other functional managers, and 0.5 members in other functions. An interesting question is in how far other stakeholders than the sponsoring organizations are integrated in project boards. So first, if you look at the team level, at the operational level, and here we distinguish between internal projects, which are shown in blue, and projects for external clients shown in green. And looking at the latter, with these external projects, in more than 50% of these external projects, the client is actually member of the project team. And also in about 1 out of 2 projects, whether they're internal or externals, 1 or more contractors is integrated in the project team. And in not quite as many cases, but frequently, other stakeholders like cooperating partners or others are also members of the project team. But of course, being part of the project team does not necessarily mean that you are represented at the governance level. And so we looked at the same questions concerning project boards, and there we found that clients are almost always on the board. So if the client is represented in the project team, he or she is also represented at board level, whereas contractors and other stakeholders are represented in boards significantly less often than they are at the operational level. So about half of the projects and programs that have contractors in the team also have contractor representatives on the board. And another thing we found is that, of course, representation at project boards also depends on the number of organizations involved. So in cases where there's three or four organizations, they are usually all represented in the board. With 5 or more organizations, as I said, it's the client who stays and the contractors who are not represented at governance levels, or at least not all of them. Steering committee meetings. Steering committees typically meet once every 3 months, so that's 49 out of, I don't quite remember what the total was, but it was around 100. So it's about half the steering committees that convene once a quarter. Some of them more frequently, even on a weekly basis, this light yellow part at the left end. Very few, so about 3 or 4% of steering committees do not have regular scheduled meetings. But more than half of the steering committees also meet ad hoc if something extraordinary or something exceptional happens. So that counting together the scheduled meeting and the ad hoc meetings, we find that the average steering committee convenes once a quarter, but most of them convene more frequently. And only 1 out of our sample did not convene at all. So we now come to the final section concerning steering committee work. So we looked at how common steering committees are, how they're staffed, how they meet. And the last question in the survey was actually a list of, I think, 17 authorities or duties you typically find on project boards. Let's just call them functions for the sake of brevity now. And the question was, or the exercise was, to assign each of these functions to the individual steering committee members. And we got this data for about 60 or 70 steering committees, representing some 400 members. So we get quite some insight into how steering committees work and function. And you see in this slide an excerpt of these 17 functions, the ones most interesting, I think. And the blue part on each bar represents the percentage of steering committees where the respective functions is performed by 1 or more members. And the light gray part on the left end represents the percentage of steering committee where this function is not covered, at least not by committee members. So for an example, we see that 90% of steering committees comprise someone who defines requirements and objectives. Similarly, someone who provides budget, someone who provides personnel, someone who represents the interests of the sponsoring organization. So in Prince 2 terms, that would be the executive. But then 1 out of 3 steering committees has nobody who represents interests of users or customers. So this senior user role only exists in 2 of 3 project boards. And similarly, the senior supplier role, someone who is ultimately accountable for delivering the project results, this role is only covered in just over half of the steering committees. We get similar figures for other types of responsibilities. So for example, someone accountable for realizing benefits can only be found in 2 of 3 project boards. Someone accountable for the business case, similar figures. And striking to me was that let me look up the figure because it's not on the slide. I think in 1 out of 4 boards of internal projects, these 3 instances, yes, in 1 out of 4 boards of an internal project, these 3 instances of lack of accountability coincide. So in fact, there's nobody accountable for anything on these project boards, which gives room for the questions what they actually steer or how they steer, if they steer at all. We further found that about half of the steering committees have 1 person with final decision-making power, and more than half of steering committees also comprise members who do not take part in making decisions but have a reporting or advisory role only. Excuse me. So the next thing we looked at is if and how these functions correlate. So what we did was, technically speaking, we calculated contingency coefficients for each possible pair of functions. And for external projects, we found that the people defining requirements are usually or are frequently the ones representing customer interest, which of course makes sense for projects delivered to an external client. For internal projects and programs, we found that requirements and objectives are commonly defined by those who then approve the deliverables, which again makes sense. But note that this role of someone accepting deliverables is missing on 25% of steering committees. Another correlation, we found that the person who provides the budget is the one with the final decision-making power, which again is not too surprising, so money rules. But we would also have expected, or at least hoped, that the person providing the budget is the person accountable for the business case. And this turns out to be not the case at all. So the correlation between these two is very close to zero. And another correlation we looked for but could not find is a correlation between accountability and decision-making authority. So we'd have expected that those people with reporting advisory roles only cannot be the ones accountable for either delivery, benefits realization, or the business case. But again, the correlation between these two is close to zero, and I'd like to show you some more details on that on the next slide because it really strikes us. So if we look at authority versus accountability, of the 351 steering committee members upon which we collected data on this question, about 3/4 they take part in decision making, 1/4 does not. So 1/4 of steering committee members are those with advisory or reporting roles. On the other hand, only 1 out of 3 board members is accountable for either delivery or the business case or realizing benefits. The other 2/3 are not accountable for anything. And this fraction, 1/3 to 2/3, is practically independent on whether they take part in decision making. So if you look at the ones taking part in decision making, again, about 1/3 is accountable for something, 2/3 are not. And those not taking part in decision making, the figures are as shown. And especially if you look at the ones accountable, so it's 117 steering board members accountable for something, 37, so about 1/3 of them is accountable but cannot take part in decision making. And we'll see who these poor people are in just a minute. But this is obviously something dysfunctional in project boards. We called it an organized form of lacking accountability. So another thing we looked at is who does what. In other words, how do these functions people perform in boards correlate with the functions or positions they hold in their permanent organization. And for C-level executives, we found that they significantly often are the ones defining requirements and objectives, providing the budget, nominating the project manager, chairing the board meetings, and the ones with the final decision-making power. All of this is not very surprising. But note that C-level executives are not the one taking accountability for the business case. Business unit heads usually or frequently are those who provide personnel and those who represent customer or user interests. And the third group, we had some interesting results for, are product managers. Product managers are frequently the ones who represent the project to senior management, and they are the ones accountable for the business case, and at the same time, they are the ones who only have a reporting or advisory role. So to summarize, and if you like, exaggerate a bit, you could say that C-level executives define the requirements, provide budget, nominate the PM, make the important decisions, but if a project doesn't pay off, it's the product manager who has to take the blame. And as a last result, so we looked closely into what C-level executives actually do, because there's one on average on each steering committee or each project board, and we asked the question, is that necessary? And interestingly, we found that for internal projects and programs, C-level executives do play an important role in committees. As I showed you before, they do the things I just mentioned, define requirements, provide budgets, represent the interests of their organizations, accept the deliverables, and also act as a primary point of contact for the project manager in about half of the cases. And very often they are the only ones doing this. So the dark part of the bars represent the percentage of steering committees where the C-level executive is the only one performing this function. So without him or her, this function would be missing. The light yellow part is the steering committees where they perform these functions along with other members. So for internal projects, this seems to make sense. For external projects or projects delivered to external clients, we find that the exclusive role of a C-level executive effectively is reduced to having final decision-making power. All other things they do, like providing personal or representing interests of their organizations, other steering committee members also do. So it seems that with external projects, having C-level executives on the board has reasons in corporate policy rather than in the necessity for the functioning of the board itself. So these are some of the, I think, interesting results we found for the German-speaking countries, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. If you like more details, you're welcome to download the study report. I provided a link in here. It's available in German and in English, or you can visit the website of our special interest group, which is available in German only. Or you're most welcome to email me, or of course, ask questions and discuss about it right now. And I'll hand back to one of the facilitators.